Have you ever imagined a scenario where the United States and Denmark, two of NATO's closest allies, could actually go to war with each other? Have you considered what it would mean for the world if America invaded Greenland, a territory that has been part of the Danish realm for centuries? And here is the question that is no longer hypothetical. What would a U.S. invasion of Greenland actually look like? And what would be the consequences for the United States, for Europe, and for the entire global order? My name is Emma Chamberlain, and today on Infographics, we are going to explore a scenario that would have seemed completely insane just a few years ago, but is now being discussed in serious terms. We are going to look at the recent escalation in tensions between the United States and Denmark over Greenland, what a military invasion would actually entail, and the catastrophic geopolitical, economic, and military consequences that would follow. This is a story about power, about alliances, about strategic miscalculation, and about how one frozen island could unravel the entire post-World War II international order. Let us start with the recent events that have made this scenario plausible. The escalation began just hours after the U.S. military raided Venezuela and seized that country's president. Katie Miller, the wife of Stephen Miller, who is the architect of President Trump's immigration and domestic policies, tweeted out an image of Greenland covered in the American flag, with a caption ominously reading, "Soon," in all capital letters. At nearly the same time, Trump himself, while aboard Air Force One, insisted that America needed Greenland from the standpoint of national security. Trump has repeatedly said over the past few weeks that anything less than full American control over Greenland is completely unacceptable to him, and that deploying military force to seize the island is not off the table. On January 14th, the Danish foreign minister and his Greenlandic counterpart met with Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Vice President J.D. Vance in Washington to discuss the status of Greenland. The meeting ended with the Danish foreign minister leaving exasperated and convinced that Trump fully intends to conquer Greenland by any means necessary. Shortly afterwards, 8 European countries sent a small token force of military personnel to Greenland to conduct joint exercises with the Danes on the island and to send a message of solidarity against the United States. Trump responded with fury. A couple of days later, on January 17th, he announced that he would be implementing new tariffs of 10% on all goods exported to the U.S. by the European countries who sent their troops to Greenland, plus Denmark, and that the rate would increase further to 25% on each of them by June 1st, unless they relented and agreed to support America's desire to purchase Greenland. Denmark and Greenland's position throughout this whole dispute has repeatedly been that Greenland is not for sale, no matter what the price on offer is. The Trump administration has repeatedly threatened that it will do whatever it takes to acquire Greenland, including using military force through an invasion, if they continue refusing. Trump has since seemingly walked back some of these threats. While speaking at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Trump for the first time said that he was dropping his military threat to seize Greenland through force. Nonetheless, he said that he was still committed to acquiring Greenland through a purchase, and complained that it had been a historical mistake for the United States to have returned Greenland to Denmark after the Second World War, when the U.S. occupied the island for a few years during the Nazi occupation of Denmark. Most recently, Trump has claimed that he has reached a compromise deal with NATO, in which smaller pockets of territory in Greenland around U.S. military base sites will effectively be ceded and transferred over to American sovereignty. This agreement is supposedly being modeled on the Sovereign Base Agreement in Cyprus, where the UK carved out 2 territories around their own military bases on the island in 1960, that are recognized sovereign British territories beyond the authority of the government in Cyprus. Denmark, however, has stated that they have rejected this agreement and that their position remains that no territory in Greenland will be ceded under any circumstances. Trump, ever unpredictable, may always return to Greenland with his pressure tactics and threats again in the future. So, what would actually happen if the United States really did launch an invasion and occupy Greenland? Allow me to explain and speculate to the best of my abilities. First of all, if the US actually did launch an invasion of Greenland, the operation to occupy and control it would be fairly simple and straightforward. Denmark, which controls Greenland as a self-governing autonomous territory, has very few actual defenses on the island. There are usually only about 150 Danish military and civilian personnel who work across 6 small military facilities on the island. Denmark has recently announced that it will be deploying 1,000 combat-ready troops to the island in light of America's threats. Nonetheless, Denmark has placed no fighter aircraft, missile defenses, or heavy ground forces on Greenland of any kind that can offer up any sort of meaningful resistance to a committed American invasion force. Denmark's tiny military presence on the island usually consists only of small patrol units and limited surveillance assets, which, ironically, is because Denmark has historically relied on the much more powerful United States to defend Greenland instead. Greenland is a geographically massive territory, roughly the same size as the entire eastern time zone of the United States. But it is also incredibly sparsely populated, home to fewer than 57,000 people, most of whom are Greenlandic Inuit by ethnicity. Because of that, there are very few population centers across the island to be concerned with taking over during an invasion scenario. Greenland's capital and largest city, Nuuk, is home to only around 20,000 people, which is already more than a third of the entire island's population, all concentrated right there. Everywhere else is basically a small settlement. An American invasion of Greenland would not look anything at all like other modern invasions in Ukraine or Iraq, or even like the U.S. military raid that captured Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro. There would not be any contested beach landings or large-scale kinetic combat operations. Instead, American invasion forces would be focused on securing control over Greenland's principal infrastructure and access points as rapidly as possible. U.S. military transport planes would land at the already existing U.S. military base in Greenland at Pituffik, while others would land at Greenland's handful of major settlements. Fighter aircraft would secure Greenland's airspace, while the Navy would secure the possible maritime approaches. The troops on the ground would deploy to quickly capture and secure the island's ports, airfields, and communication systems, to deny access to Greenland from reinforcements coming from Europe. This operation would kind of resemble Russia's capture of Crimea in 2014. Doing so would not require a large invasion force, like what was recently deployed to Venezuela. Most military theorists argue that in order to successfully occupy and hold a territory and combat the insurgency from the local population, you need a ratio of about 20 to 25 occupying soldiers per 1,000 residents to conduct counterinsurgency operations. That implies that in order to occupy and hold Greenland and suppress an insurgency from the local population, the American invasion force would realistically only need to consist of between 1,140 and 1,425 soldiers. That is only a fraction of the armed force that the U.S. assembled off the coast of Venezuela before the operation that seized Maduro. Realistically, when considering that Denmark might have up to 1,000 soldiers present in Greenland for defense, the U.S. would probably not need to commit any more than 10,000 of its own soldiers to the initial invasion and occupation. With no air defenses, no fighter aircraft, and no heavy ground forces to worry about in Greenland, a lightning and determined U.S. operation to seize control over the island would likely be successful. It would probably also involve minimal bloodshed, even with Denmark's recent but still modest and under-equipped deployments. Indeed, the local Greenlandic opposition would no doubt vehemently resist the whole operation. According to a poll in 2025 conducted by a Danish paper, Nearly 85% of Greenland's population rejects the idea of joining the United States. There would be virtually universal protest and resistance, and probably even initial insurgent activities against the invasion. But they are so few in number and so lightly armed that any substantial resistance could not possibly last for very long. Take the example of Argentina's invasion and occupation of the Falkland Islands in 1982. In what I believe would be the most similar modern historical comparison to this, Argentina invaded and occupied the British-controlled Falkland Islands with an initial force of about 2,000 soldiers and Marines, who were able to rapidly overpower the tiny British population on the islands, which only numbered around 2,000 themselves. Only 68 Royal Marines were present on the islands to resist the initial 2,000-strong Argentine invasion force, and their capability to resist was very limited. They initially fought back and killed one of the invading Argentine soldiers, but other than that, they were ordered to avoid heavy casualties and quickly surrendered within hours. A similar course of events would almost certainly take place during a hypothetical U.S. invasion of Greenland today. The initial military takeover of the island would be fairly easy and well within the capabilities of the United States. But what would come afterwards would be absolutely catastrophic from an economic, geopolitical, and political perspective. During an interview with CNN in early January, Stephen Miller exclaimed that nobody would fight the United States militarily over the future of Greenland. Indeed, this was the exact same belief that drove Argentina to invade and occupy the Falkland Islands in 1982. The assumption that the Falkland Islands were not actually important enough to the British to really start a war over. In their case, Argentina grossly miscalculated Britain's willingness to defend its own territory, no matter how far away from the mainland and sparsely populated. This triggered a ferocious British counteroffensive that drove them out of the islands, killed hundreds of soldiers, and even resulted in the collapse of their government. In that case, however, Britain's military capabilities far exceeded those of Argentina, which of course influenced their decision to counterattack. During a U.S. invasion of Greenland scenario, though, the opposite situation would be in place, because America's military capabilities utterly dwarf those of Denmark, and indeed even the whole of Europe combined. The budget of the U.S. military is nearly 100 times larger than the Danish military's budget. U.S. military spending alone makes up around 2/3 of all of NATO's collective military spending put together, meaning that the U.S. spends roughly twice as much on its military as every single other country in NATO combined. Unlike during the Argentine invasion of the Falklands scenario, when Britain realistically could consider a military response to retake the islands, Denmark and even the rest of Europe would simply not have the same option to work with. Denmark could, and almost certainly would, immediately take every possible political avenue available to protest against America's invasion and occupation. Politically, while Greenland is a part of the Kingdom of Denmark, it is not itself a member of the EU or considered EU territory. Because of that legal distinction, it is ambiguous and unclear if the EU's Mutual Defense Clause would actually be able to be triggered over a Greenland invasion. But since Greenland is actually a part of NATO, NATO's Mutual Defense Clause would be much more legally concrete than the EU's would be. So right away, Denmark would argue that America's invasion of a sovereign territory in Greenland directly violated Article 5 of NATO's founding treaty, which asserts that an armed attack against the territory of one NATO member shall be considered an armed attack against all of the other members as well. The problem with this direction is that NATO, as an organization, was never founded with the belief that one of the alliance's members would blatantly attack another one. And so there is no internal mechanism within NATO that is built to handle a situation like this. It is important to state that NATO has experienced significant internal military tensions between its members in the past. Between the 1950s and 70s, the UK and Iceland engaged in the so-called Cod Wars over fishing rights in the North Atlantic that culminated with Icelandic ships actually opening fire on British ships in 1975, and Iceland's threat that it would even withdraw from NATO entirely before the crisis was diffused diplomatically. In the 1990s and 2000s, during NATO's expansion east, there were significant concerns at the time about the renewal of border disputes concerning Hungary and the large Hungarian majority territories in neighboring Romania and Slovakia. And most critically of all, there has been the long-running military confrontation between Greece and Turkey, who, until recently, were considered the most likely two NATO countries to go to war with each other. Turkey and Greece both joined NATO in the 1950s, but in 1974, Turkey invaded Cyprus and entered into direct conflict with Greek troops who were present there, after which Greece withdrew from NATO's integrated military command for the next 6 years in protest. Both sides maintained extensive and bitter maritime disputes against each other in the Aegean Sea. In 1996, a Greek fighter aircraft even shot down a Turkish fighter over the Aegean Sea and killed its Turkish pilot. And as recently as 2020, a Turkish warship locked its fire control radar system onto a French frigate in the eastern Mediterranean during boiling tensions over the civil war in Libya. Ultimately, none of these incidents between NATO members caused any long-lasting impacts. But a full-on invasion by the United States into the sovereign territory of another NATO member would make all of these previous incidents seem like child's play by comparison. Denmark would argue to the North Atlantic Council, NATO's decision-making body, that the United States had directly violated Article 5 of the NATO Treaty. The problem is that in order for the North Atlantic Council to actually activate Article 5, it requires the universal consensus of all 32 of the NATO allied members. If any one of the NATO allies refuses to give its approval to the Council for an Article 5 violation, then there will not be a consensus, and Article 5 will not be formally triggered. This essentially gives any NATO member a de facto veto power over the triggering of Article 5 by the Council, by simply refusing to give its approval. In this scenario, the United States would almost certainly do this and block the Article 5 clause from being formally activated in response to its own invasion. Even if every single other NATO member approved of it, NATO, in effect, would become paralyzed and trapped by the invasion, and would not be capable of formally responding to it as a collective organization. This is why many analysts and politicians say that a U.S. invasion of Greenland would immediately spell the death of NATO as an organization, including Denmark's own Prime Minister, Mette Frederiksen. The United States is the fundamental core of NATO as an organization. Not only does the U.S. alone make up 2/3 of NATO's collective military spending, but for more than 3/4 of a century now, the Supreme Allied Commander Europe, the second highest-ranking position within the alliance, has always been held by an American general, including today. This commander is responsible for drafting NATO's defense plans for Europe, including Greenland, and they have consequently always assumed a high degree of U.S. military involvement. U.S. military officers are deeply interconnected throughout every major NATO command. Responding through NATO, an organization that is dominated by the U.S., against armed U.S. aggression will simply not be possible, and that could well spell the rapid collapse of NATO as an organization, as trust in the U.S. among NATO's other allies will immediately evaporate. To say nothing of the absolute collapse of faith in the United States and Denmark, which has historically been among America's greatest, most loyal, and most effective allies, with an incredible geographic vantage point along the Danish Straits, enabling it to bottle up the Russian Baltic Sea Fleet within the Baltic. Losing that ally alone would be an absolutely catastrophic consequence. The nations of Europe would at this point likely face the greatest moment in their history since the Second World War, with an impossibly difficult decision to make. Would they rebuke the U.S. invasion and occupation of Greenland, or would they try to accept it and continue on with business as usual as much as possible? On the one hand, many European countries would likely feel that Greenland is simply not important enough to risk completely shattering ties with the U.S. The UK, Norway, Denmark, the Netherlands, and Italy all currently operate the F-35 fighter as a part of their militaries. Finland, Belgium, Germany, Poland, Czechia, Romania, and Greece have all ordered F-35s and are awaiting their deliveries. An immediate shattering of relations with the U.S. over the Greenland issue risks the U.S. withholding access to the communications, targeting data, and munitions that are necessary to adequately operate the F-35. In a flash, this would immediately undermine and weaken all of their air forces and capabilities, and crash tens of billions of dollars worth of already paid-for orders. Worse, European militaries would have no palatable options to replace their effectively bricked F-35s. The only other countries that manufacture true fifth-generation fighters, as advanced as the F-35, are Russia and China, neither of which is a particularly attractive supplier to Europe either. European-made alternatives, like the French-made Rafale or the Swedish-made Gripen, are fourth-and-a-half-generation fighters, and not as advanced or capable as the F-35. Completely replacing the F-35 with domestically produced Rafale or Gripen fighters would take at least a decade, cost tens of billions of euros worth of unexpected costs, and still leave European air forces disadvantaged when compared to the American and Russian air forces, who both possess true fifth-generation fighter capabilities. All of this alone would make strongly confronting the U.S. over a Greenland invasion a bitter pill for many of the European countries to swallow. The British military is deeply dependent on the U.S., especially for its nuclear deterrent. The U.K. does not own its Trident missiles, but leases them from a shared U.S.-UK pool. If the U.K. confronted the U.S. over Greenland, America could end the lease, crippling Britain's nuclear force. Re-establishing an independent deterrent would take decades and cost tens of billions. The UK's future nuclear submarine program under AUKUS also relies on US technology, which could be withdrawn. If NATO collapses over Greenland, Russia might exploit the chaos. It could seize Narva, a majority Russian city in Estonia, claiming it rightfully belongs to Russia. Estonia could invoke the EU's Mutual Defense Clause, but that would exclude the US, UK, Canada, and Turkey. Russia might gamble that the EU would not forcefully respond. Ukraine's hopes of joining NATO would also be dashed, and European nations would face an impossible choice between supporting Ukraine and confronting the US over Greenland. Trust in the US among European allies would be permanently destroyed. The UK, the Netherlands, and France would fear America might next seize their Caribbean territories. Any chance of US-European cooperation would vanish for decades, a disaster amid competition with China and Russia. China would feel freer to take Taiwan, and Russia would be emboldened in Ukraine and the Baltics. Europe could retaliate indirectly. It could force the closure of key US bases like Ramstein in Germany, Rota in Spain, and others, crippling America's power projection. Britain could threaten the U.S. base on Diego Garcia, critical for Indo-Pacific operations. Economically, Europe could target U.S. tech firms with fines or bans, crashing their stocks. It could restrict U.S. access to ASML's advanced chip-making machines, though this would trigger mutual destruction, since U.S. companies supply ASML's components. Selling U.S. treasuries en masse would hurt Europe more than America, burning trillions of its own reserves. Canada would face a strategic disaster. Encircled by a hostile U.S. after Greenland's seizure, it would have to militarize its border and possibly build nuclear weapons. Relations with America would be wrecked for a generation. All this for an island where the U.S. already has basing rights and which holds little economic value. Rare earth mining has been impractical under ice sheets for decades. The real Arctic threat is around Alaska, where 91 of 95 recent Russian-Chinese incursions occurred. The U.S. should instead rebuild its base on Adak in the Aleutians, which guards the Bering Strait and is closer to Taiwan. Greenland is not worth destroying NATO, losing allies, and triggering global instability. Only 7% of Americans support invading it. Such an act would be one of history's greatest foreign policy blunders. If you found value in this deep dive, subscribe to Infographics and share it. Understanding our fragile world helps us navigate it. Thank you for watching.